My son looked me in the eyes and said I wasn't invited to his wedding. And the way he said it, so casual, so emotionless, it felt like my chest collapsed right there at the dinner table. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, holding my fork midair, trying to convince myself I'd misheard him. There were 5 of us at that table. Cameron, Tanya, her parents, and me. It was supposed to be a celebration. Tanya had just gotten promoted at her firm, and they'd invited me out, insisting I come. "We have something exciting to share," Tanya had said on the phone. I assumed it was a vacation announcement, or maybe even a pregnancy. What I never expected was to be told, in such a cool and calculated tone, that my presence wasn't welcome on what should have been one of the most beautiful days of my son's life. He didn't even look nervous, just firm, resigned, like this had been decided long before that dinner, and my reaction didn't matter. Tanya smiled awkwardly, her hand resting gently on his. "We're doing something a bit more refined," she said. "A very curated guest list. Think destination, intimate, sophisticated." She looked at me like I was a dusty antique that didn't match the decor. I tried to ask why I wasn't invited, what I had done, why I was being excluded from a moment I'd imagined since the day I first held Cameron in my arms. But the words wouldn't come out. My tongue felt heavy, my throat dry. I couldn't think. I could barely breathe. And Cameron? He just took a sip of his wine and kept talking like nothing had happened. Like the foundation of our relationship hadn't just cracked open in the middle of that room. No emotion, no guilt, not even discomfort. That's what made it worse. The indifference. I forced a polite smile. I didn't want to make a scene, but inside I was unraveling. I felt myself shrinking in that chair, like I had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I picked at my food. I laughed when appropriate, but I couldn't hear the rest of the conversation. It was all a distant hum. My heart was pounding too loud. After dessert, I excused myself early. Tanya said, "So lovely seeing you, Marla." I nodded. I don't remember the drive home. All I remember is the cold silence in my car and the way my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I kept replaying the moment over and over, wondering what kind of son does that, wondering who he had become, wondering when I had stopped being his mother in his eyes. I raised Cameron on stories, songs, and secondhand sweaters. He was my only child, bright-eyed, tender-hearted, and curious about everything. After my husband, Thomas, passed away from pancreatic cancer when Cameron was just 18, it felt like we had to rebuild our lives from rubble. The grief was loud at first, like a siren, but over time, it softened into a quiet partnership between the 2 of us. We learned how to smile again, together. Back then, Cameron used to call me every night from college, sometimes just to tell me he was microwaving soup or that he'd passed a hard exam. He'd say, "Love you, Mom," with that casual warmth that only comes when someone really means it. And I never doubted for a second that he did. We weren't wealthy, but Thomas and I were careful. He worked at the post office for 34 years. I taught 2nd grade until I retired at 65. We saved, skipped luxuries, and kept things simple. Our house in Vermont was modest. 2 bedrooms, creaky floors, a wraparound porch with a wind chime Thomas had made himself. But it was filled with love. I kept it tidy, filled it with potted plants, cinnamon-scented candles, and the sound of classical music playing from the radio. When Cameron met Tanya, I was happy for him, genuinely. She was sharp, beautiful, and ambitious. A financial advisor from Boston with a strong handshake and perfect hair. The first time he brought her home, I made lemon cake and asked about her family. She answered politely, but I could tell she was evaluating me, like she was scanning for flaws. She didn't eat much, complimented the quaintness of my home, and asked a few questions about my retirement savings. Odd questions. I chalked it up to nerves. Over time, Tanya began to shape Cameron's life. His wardrobe changed. His speech patterns shifted. He stopped coming home for Thanksgiving, choosing instead to fly to Aspen with her parents. He still called sometimes, but the calls became shorter, less laughter, more formality, like he had a script to follow. I never confronted him about it. I didn't want to be the bitter mother who couldn't let go. That's what Ruth, my younger sister, who lives in Minnesota, always warned me against. "Don't push, Marla," she'd say. "He'll come back around." But the changes kept coming. When Thomas died, I became the keeper of all the family's memories. The old photo albums, the letters he wrote Cameron from his hospital bed. I offered them to Cameron one Christmas. He took the box, thanked me, and left it in the trunk of his car. He never brought it up again. It wasn't until the wedding conversation that I realized how far we'd drifted. Or maybe not drifted. Maybe I'd been quietly pushed aside, one polished word at a time. The boy who once cried into my sweater after scraping his knee now looked at me like a problem to manage. And I kept wondering if I'd missed a moment, some critical point when he stopped seeing me as his anchor and started seeing me as his weight. But the truth is, I had spent years carrying the weight of this family with quiet pride. I never asked for gratitude. I just wanted to be there, beside him, on the day he made one of life's biggest promises. Not for speeches, not for photos, just to witness it as his mother. And even that was too much to ask. It was a Friday afternoon when Cameron invited me to lunch. He said Tanya's parents were in town and wanted to catch up. "Nothing big, just lunch," he texted. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 months, so I said yes, right away. I even put on the soft blue cardigan he used to compliment when he was younger, the one that Thomas said brought out my eyes. The restaurant was one of those sleek, modern places with tall white walls, glass partitions, and music that felt like it was humming straight through your bones. Tanya's parents were already seated when I arrived. Her mother greeted me with a stiff nod. Her father smiled politely, but didn't offer much beyond a handshake. Tanya barely looked up from her phone. Then Cameron arrived, late but charming, as always. He kissed me on the cheek and asked how I'd been. I told him the lilacs had finally bloomed in the yard, that I'd been reading a new mystery novel. He nodded, distracted, already reaching for the wine list. Something in his energy felt off, rushed, almost impatient, but I told myself not to overthink it. We ordered. Tanya talked about her firm, how they were closing a 7-figure deal. Her father discussed golf. I smiled, nodded, tried to find my place in the conversation, but I could feel I didn't belong. It was like watching a play where I wasn't sure if I was part of the cast or the audience. Halfway through lunch, Tanya cleared her throat and placed her hand over Cameron's. "We have some exciting news," she said, beaming. "We're getting married." I clapped my hands together. My heart lifted. "Oh, that's wonderful. When's the big day?" Cameron glanced at Tanya. She gave a slight nod. He turned back to me, and then, just like that, he said it. "You're not invited to the wedding." I blinked. I'm sorry. "It's going to be small," he added quickly. "Very curated, just a tight circle." Tanya chimed in, smiling with the same expression someone might use when telling a child they're too old for the kiddie table. "We're keeping it clean and intentional. No stress. We want the focus to be on our new life, not on obligations from the past." Obligations. I sat there, stunned. I stared at my son, I didn't recognize the man in front of me. He wasn't cruel, but he was cold, distant, like he'd rehearsed this line. Like it wasn't meant to hurt. It was just a necessary formality in whatever story he and Tanya were writing for themselves. I tried to keep my composure. I felt the sting of tears forming, but forced them back. I wouldn't give them that moment. I wouldn't give him that moment. Well, I said softly, I hope it's a beautiful day. That was all I could manage. My hands trembled as I reached for my water. No one said anything. The silence between us was louder than any argument could have been. Dessert came and went. Tanya's mother complimented the crème brûlée. Cameron laughed at something Tanya's father said. I felt invisible, like I had somehow vanished from the table altogether. When the check came, Cameron paid. He gave me a side hug on the sidewalk outside. Thanks for coming, Mom, he said, as if we'd just had any other lunch. I watched him walk away with Tanya, hand in hand. He didn't look back. In that moment, I felt something break. Not a dramatic shatter, but a quiet, final snap. A thread between us, frayed over years, had finally come loose. And the part that hurt the most wasn't the rejection. It was the fact that he didn't seem to care. I sat in my driveway for nearly 20 minutes after I got home, staring at the lilacs blooming along the fence. They were Thomas's favorite. He used to say they smelled like spring was apologizing for the winter. I watched them sway in the breeze, but I couldn't feel anything. Not sadness, not anger, just this numb, sinking emptiness that seemed to settle in my bones. Eventually, I went inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. I set my purse on the entry table and kicked off my shoes, then just stood there, staring at the family photos lining the hallway. One of Cameron at 5, missing both front teeth and grinning up at a birthday cake. One of the 3 of us at the lake cabin, Thomas's arms around both of us. I reached out and touched the glass. My hand shook. I made myself a cup of tea out of habit, not because I wanted it. The kettle whistled and I poured the water, then sat at the kitchen table, cradling the cup, watching the steam rise and disappear. The light above the table flickered for a second. I didn't bother fixing it. I just stared. The silence was unbearable. I got up and wandered into the hallway closet where I kept old storage boxes. I pulled out one marked Cameron School Years. It was heavy with crayon drawings, field trip photos, and handmade Mother's Day cards. I opened one from 2nd grade. Inside, in shaky pencil letters, he'd written, "You're the best mom ever. If I get married one day, I want to dance with you." I covered my mouth and tried not to sob, but I couldn't stop it. I pressed that card to my chest and rocked slightly in the chair, the tears falling fast and quiet. Grief like that doesn't wail, it crushes. And in that moment, I wasn't a woman with gray in her hair and years behind her. I was just a mother whose son had stopped loving her loud enough to want her there. I sat like that for hours. The sun set, the tea went cold. I didn't turn on the lights. I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind kept looping back to that lunch. The way he said it, his voice, that blank look in his eyes. I kept wondering, what had I done so wrong? Had I held on too tight? Had I not let go soon enough? Around midnight, I got up and opened the old chest at the foot of my bed. It was where I kept things I couldn't quite part with. Thomas's college ring, a pressed flower from our wedding day, and a tiny pair of blue baby shoes. Cameron's first. I held them in my lap. They were soft and scuffed, worn at the toes from those early, wobbly steps. I used to kiss his feet after bath time and call them my lucky feet. I remembered him giggling, squealing, when I blew raspberries on his toes. I would have given anything to hear that laugh again. I lay down, but couldn't sleep. My body was still, but my heart raced. I stared at the ceiling, thinking of every choice I'd made, every bedtime story I read, every sandwich I packed, every fever I soothed. I kept thinking, was it not enough? Was I not enough? But somewhere in the stillness, as the night dragged toward morning, a quieter voice inside whispered something else. Something painful, but clear. This isn't about you not being enough. This is about him forgetting who you are. And that, somehow, was even harder to accept. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My eyes were swollen, my chest heavy. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window for a long time, watching the light shift across the floor. It was quiet again, but not peaceful, just empty. I didn't have a plan. I just needed something to do, some task to occupy my hands, so my thoughts wouldn't keep circling the same painful track. So I went to the attic. I hadn't been up there in years, not since before the arthritis in my knees started acting up. But I climbed the stairs anyway, one slow step at a time, holding the rail like it was a lifeline. The attic smelled like cedar and dust. Sunlight filtered in through the small, round window, illuminating boxes that hadn't been touched since Thomas died. I started opening them randomly, brushing aside old packing paper and flipping through faded papers. Most were ordinary: tax returns, teaching contracts, birthday cards. But in the back corner was a small fireproof lockbox I'd nearly forgotten about. It was Thomas's. I brought it down and sat cross-legged on the floor of the guest room. I still had the key, taped inside the bottom drawer of my vanity, exactly where he told me he'd put it in case of an emergency. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock. It clicked open with a quiet finality, like something sacred unfolding. Inside were neatly stacked documents: our will, insurance policies, and a folder labeled Cameron, Trust Details. I blinked. Trust? I didn't remember a trust. I opened the folder carefully, and there it was. Thomas had set up a financial trust for Cameron the year before he died. It wasn't enormous, but it was substantial. Enough to put a down payment on a home, start a business, or cushion a new marriage. But there was a clause. A small, handwritten note attached with a paperclip in red. Funds may only be released upon the event of marriage, with Marla's signed approval as guardian and trustee. I want him to marry for love, not money. She'll know. I read that line over and over. She'll know. The signature was notarized, sealed, legal. I felt a mix of disbelief and awe. I had forgotten all about this. At the time, I was too busy grieving, trying to keep Cameron afloat, managing bills, writing lesson plans, handling hospital paperwork. But Thomas hadn't forgotten. He'd seen further than I had. He knew there might come a day when Cameron would need reminding of what truly mattered. I sat there frozen, the document in my lap, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a blanket that no longer offered warmth. My mind was racing, but my heart was calm. For the first time in days. Not out of revenge, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I had a say in this. Not over his choices, but over what I gave. I couldn't make Cameron be the boy I once knew, but I could choose how I responded now. And I realized I held something more powerful than an invitation to a wedding. I held a mirror, one that could reflect everything he had forgotten, who he was, and where he came from. And in that moment, I knew I wouldn't keep it from him. I would give him the gift, but not the way he expected. I didn't rush. I gave myself one more day to think. I took long walks around the neighborhood, baked a small loaf of banana bread I ended up giving to Ruth's old friend down the street, and watched the birds gather by the feeder Thomas had nailed to the fence years ago. But all the while, the trust papers stayed on my kitchen table, neatly stacked and waiting. That night, I sat in my armchair with a notepad and pen and started writing ideas. Not schemes, not ways to punish, just ways to be heard, to say what hadn't been said, to make Cameron see the difference between inheritance and intention, between money and meaning. Because if I'd just torn the papers up or withheld the trust out of hurt, I'd be doing what Tanya probably expected, reacting, making it about me. And I didn't want this to be about me. I wanted it to be about Cameron and the life I once hoped he'd build. I called Mr. Halbrook the next morning. He'd been our family attorney for decades. A quiet man with silver hair, always wore sweater vests, and smelled faintly of peppermint. When I explained what I'd found, he was stunned. "Thomas never mentioned this to me directly," he said. "But this is solid. Your approval is required before any disbursement. Has Cameron even asked about it?" "No," I said. "I don't think he knows it exists." Halbrook paused. "Then the timing here is important. You could stop this entirely." "I don't want to stop it," I said. "I just want him to remember who he is before he takes the next step." He nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure it's delivered with care, legally and emotionally." We made arrangements. The trust would be made available if I signed, but I asked Halbrook to wait. I had something else in mind first. Back at home, I opened a fresh sheet of stationery, the kind Thomas used to write me anniversary notes on. Thick, cream-colored, no frills. I wrote Cameron a letter, a real one, not angry, not accusatory, just honest. I told him what it felt like to sit at that restaurant table. I told him about the baby shoes I held the night after, about the ache of being erased, and the hope that lived quietly under all of it. Then I gathered a few things. First, a photograph, one I knew he'd forgotten. It was the three of us, covered in mud, after a rainstorm ruined our camping trip in Maine. We were laughing so hard, Thomas could barely hold the camera. Cameron had no front teeth. My hair was a mess, but we were happy, purely, truly happy. Then I added a small wooden box. Thomas had made it in his workshop before the cancer took away his strength. I lined it with soft felt and placed the letter inside, the photo, and a certified copy of the trust clause, highlighted where my signature would normally go. But instead of signing it, I included a check for the full amount, written in my hand, with one line in the memo. "Use this wisely and remember where you came from." It wasn't a legal move. It was something stronger, a personal one. A mother's final way of reaching out not to stop a wedding, but to reach the boy who had once needed only me to feel safe in the world. I sealed the box, addressed it to the wedding venue, no return address, and then I waited, not for a response, but for peace. The wedding day came like a storm I could see rolling in from a distance. Loud, certain, impossible to ignore. I didn't check social media. I didn't call anyone. I spent that morning cleaning out the garden shed. Dirt under my nails, sweat on my brow. It felt good to move, to be doing something physical while everything inside me wanted to spiral. I knew where they were. A vineyard outside of Boston, elegant, expensive, and dressed to impress. I imagined the white chairs, the tall flower arrangements, the curated playlist Tanya probably approved down to the second. I imagined Cameron in a tailored suit, smiling for photographs that would never include me. And I imagined the box, sitting quietly behind the scenes, waiting for someone to open it. I had it delivered that morning, hand-delivered by courier, just as the guests were arriving. I didn't put a note on the outside. No drama, no warning, just his name, neat and simple, Inside that wooden box were pieces of a history Tanya would never understand. A mother's letter, a muddy photo from a better time, and a check that held no strings but carried every ounce of meaning I had left to offer. As the ceremony unfolded miles away, I sat on my porch, wrapped in a shawl Thomas had given me our last Christmas together. I didn't cry, not this time. I listened to the wind chimes. I drank tea with too much honey. I was there, present, steady, and I kept thinking, he'll open it tonight. Maybe not until after the last dance. Maybe not until Tanya's asleep, but he'll open it. And when he does, it'll all come back to him. He'd see that picture and remember what joy looked like before it had rules. He'd read my letter and feel, maybe for the first time in years, that quiet tug of truth. The kind that doesn't shout or beg, just whispers, look closely. This is who you are. I didn't want to ruin his wedding. I didn't want to reclaim the spotlight. I wanted him to pause, to feel something real. And that's what that box was. Not revenge, not resistance, just the softest, strongest reminder I could send. By sundown, the light outside turned amber. I lit a candle on the kitchen table and placed the small pair of baby shoes beside it. Then I sat down to write in my journal, not about pain or betrayal, but about letting go. I had done what I came to do. Now it was his turn. 2 days passed before I heard from him. It was early evening. I had just finished watering the geraniums and was washing up in the kitchen when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Part of me expected it to be Ruth or a neighbor asking about a casserole dish. But when I picked up and heard nothing but a shaky breath on the other end, my heart knew before my mind caught up. Mom? His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in hours, or maybe like he'd been crying. I got the box. There was a long silence. I didn't rush to fill it. I could hear cars passing in the background. Wind, maybe. And then, just above a whisper, "Why did you do that?" I sat down at the kitchen table. My thumb traced the rim of my teacup. I answered gently, "Because I needed you to remember." His breath caught. I could hear it. That fragile sound someone makes when the weight they've been carrying finally lands. He said, Tanya was furious. She said I should have told her about the trust, said it was manipulative of you, that you were trying to buy your way back in. I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. She left yesterday, packed a bag and went to her parents' place. I waited, not because I wanted to hear more, but because I wanted him to say more. "I don't know who I've been," he said. "I read your letter 3 times. I couldn't stop staring at that photo. I look happy in it, not polished, not perfect, just like I knew where I belonged." I closed my eyes. The ache I'd carried for days softened, just a little. He admitted things I hadn't expected him to. How he'd stopped calling not because he was too busy, but because he didn't know how to explain the guilt. How every time I'd reached out, he felt like he was being reminded of someone he'd let down. And how Tanya didn't dislike me, not exactly. She just wanted to control the narrative, to streamline their lives. And I didn't fit into that version. "I let her shut you out," he said. "And I didn't fight it. That's on me. I didn't cry. I think he expected me to. But I'd cried all I could the night of that lunch. What I felt now wasn't grief. It was grief's quieter cousin. The one that knows better than to expect clean apologies or fairy tale reunions. This wasn't a repair. It was a reckoning. I told him I loved him. I told him that I always had. But I also told him something harder. Love doesn't mean I wait forever in the shadows. He asked if he could come see me. Not that night, but soon. I told him yes. And then, because I needed him to understand, I added, "But not until you know what you're asking for." I won't be someone you visit out of guilt. There was a pause. Then, very softly, I don't want you in the shadows, Mom. I want you in my life. Really in it. That was the first moment I let myself believe that maybe. Not certainly, but maybe. This wasn't the end. Maybe it was the start of something new. Not what we had. Not what I dreamed of. But something honest. Something earned. A week later, he came. No announcement, no text, asking if I was free. Just a quiet knock on the door late one afternoon, while the sun was dipping behind the trees. I opened it to find him standing there, shoulders hunched like a boy again, holding a small bouquet of flowers that looked like he'd picked them up from the gas station on the way over. I didn't care. He could have shown up empty-handed. It was enough that he showed up at all. He stepped inside slowly, glancing around, like the house might have changed in his absence. It hadn't. The same framed photos hung on the wall. The same quilt lay draped over the back of the couch. The only difference was the silence. Now, it wasn't hollow. It was waiting. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place I'd sat alone with a cup of untouched tea the night after he'd cut me out. But now, there was something new between us. The truth. Not the kind that arrives in a single conversation, but the kind that builds slowly, painful, real, and needed. He apologized again, this time with more clarity. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain it all away. He simply said, I lost sight of who I was. And I think I was afraid that who I used to be wouldn't be good enough for the life I was trying to build. And I told him what I had come to understand too, that I had held on too tightly in some ways, too quietly in others, that I had assumed love was enough to protect us from change, and maybe it wasn't. But grace could be. Forgiveness could be. We didn't talk about Tanya much. He said only that things were paused, that he needed time to think without her voice in his ear. I didn't pry. That part of his life was his to choose. I was only there to remind him that he still had a home if he wanted one. Before he left, he stood by the door, looking at the photo wall. His eyes landed on the one I had pinned up a few days earlier, me, standing at the edge of a lake, fishing pole in hand, wearing a ridiculous sun hat. Smiling like the wind had just told me a secret. He pointed at it and laughed softly. You look free, he said. I am, I replied. And I meant it. Later that evening, I took a walk down by the water near the edge of town. The air smelled like pine in early summer. I found a bench and sat with my thoughts, not sad, not restless, just open. I watched the ripples dance across the surface of the lake and felt, for the first time in a long while, a quiet pride rise up in me. Not because I'd won anything, not because I'd been vindicated, but because I'd walked through heartbreak with dignity. Because I didn't fold, I didn't yell, I didn't try to control the story. I simply told the truth. I let go, and in doing so, I gave both of us the chance to come back. Not to what we were, but to something more honest. That's the strange thing about love. Sometimes the most powerful way to hold on is to let go. The summer drifted into early fall, and with it came a new rhythm. One that didn't revolve around waiting for someone to call, or checking the mailbox hoping for a sign that I still mattered. I no longer measured my days by who needed me, but by what gave me peace. I sold the house quietly in September. No fuss, no sentimentality. It had served its purpose, held its memories. But it was time. I bought a small cabin near a lake about 2 hours north, surrounded by pine trees, in a crooked old dock that jutted into the water like a forgotten thought. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was living on my own terms. The first few mornings there, I would wake up with the sun and make coffee while the mist still hovered over the lake. I'd pull on my slippers, wrap myself in Thomas's old flannel, and step outside just to listen to the water lapping against the shore, the wind rustling through the trees, the silence that wasn't loneliness anymore, but clarity. I joined a local reading group at the town library. I volunteered at the community literacy center once a week, helping adults learn to read or study for their GEDs. I met people who had lived whole lives in this quiet part of the world. People who didn't care about curated weddings or designer flatware. They cared about stories and roots and good soup on a cold day. Cameron called sometimes, not every day, but enough. The conversations were slower now, more careful, like we were learning a new language together, one that didn't include pretending. He visited the cabin once in October. We went for a walk through the woods. He held my hand when the path turned rocky. We didn't talk about Tanya. He didn't need to. The silence between us then wasn't heavy. It was healing. One night, after he left, I pulled out the old photo of us from that muddy camping trip. I pinned it above my writing desk. Next to it, I placed a new picture. Just me, standing at the edge of the dock, fishing pole in one hand, the wind tugging at my sweater, smiling, without anyone behind the camera, just smiling, because I could. I didn't need to explain what happened. Not to friends, not to neighbors, not even to myself. Some stories don't need retelling to be understood. Some endings aren't really endings at all. They're openings, quiet, soft, steady openings into the life that comes after. And this life I have now, isn't perfect, but it's true. It's real. It's mine. What happened with my son didn't destroy me. It revealed me. And in the end, that's the gift I gave him. Not the check, not the trust fund, but the reminder that love, real love, isn't a transaction. It's a choice. Sometimes the hardest one, but always the most powerful. And I will always choose it, even when it hurts, even when it's quiet, even when it means letting go, so that something better has space to grow.